A national childcare scandal and the opposition mooting a referendum to deport dual citizens who commit serious crimes. I'm Stephaine Dalzell, live from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he supports an investigation into the childcare sector after Four Corners exposed systemic issues and cases of abuse and neglect. The government is rejecting the Greens' call for a royal commission into the sector. So, what kind of investigation will there be? I'll speak to Early Childhood Education Minister Anne Aly and Greens leader Adam Bandt live this hour. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has called for a public debate about changing the Constitution to give politicians the ability to deport dual citizens. That's despite the Coalition's previous criticisms of the Voice to Parliament referendum over its $450 million price tag. So, will he take this idea to the election? Trade Minister Don Farrell has held more talks with US officials in the hope Australia will avoid further US tariffs. Last week, the US put a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium imports. The Federal Treasurer says the indirect impacts of a global trade war on the Australian economy could be up to 4 times larger than the initial tariffs. So does Australia have any leeway here? I'll ask Shadow Trade Minister Kevin Hogan. Let's begin with our top story today. The Prime Minister was quick to support an investigation into the childcare sector after Four Corners exposed systemic issues and cases of abuse and neglect. But he hosed down calls from the Greens for a royal commission.
People call for royal commissions whenever anything comes out immediately. They take years, they cost a lot of money. You don't need a royal commission to show that what was on TV last night is wrong.
Let's bring in Greens leader Adam Bandt now, who's calling for a royal commission into the sector. Thanks for joining us, Adam. Firstly, I'll just ask you, we heard the Prime Minister say there needs to be an investigation into the childcare sector, but said a royal commission wasn't required. Why do you think it's necessary?
Look, we've heard some incredibly distressing reports of youngest of children being restrained, being force-fed, finding out that 1 in 10 centres doesn't get a visit from the regulator, and then for some, when they do, the children get put in vans when the regulator comes and inspects so that the centre appears to meet their standards. We are really worried that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and we've had a royal commission into aged care sectors, into other areas when systemic problems start to get revealed, and I think it is absolutely needed here to work out the pathway to stop this sector being used as an opportunity for big corporations and cowboy operators to try and make profits out of caring for and educating our youngest children, and to work out just how deep these problems go, why it is that the federal government has tipped billions of dollars into these private operators while these abuses have continued, and to work out how we get towards a system where we start treating early childhood education in the same way that we treat our schools, that is properly publicly funded and seen as a public responsibility rather than an excuse for these big corporations to make a profit. Now, of course, there are things that need to be done right now and done immediately. We need to make sure that the regulator is properly funded. The government has previously announced some money for what they're calling childcare deserts to allow new centres to be built. We've got to make sure that that money goes into the public sector rather than to some of these big corporate operators that we've seen are now committing some of these incredible abuses. But the Royal Commission running side by side with that can find out just how deep this problem goes and help us work out how we get towards that system of childcare, early childhood education being treated as a public good, not as an opportunity to make profit.
Experts in the sector, like the Parenthood, have already come out and said they don't need another review. They say there's been many reviews which have all found that regulators aren't being funded properly to ensure services are upheld. What would a Royal Commission tell us that we don't already know?
Well, look, they're right that we need to properly fund the regulator. That has been told for some time. And why is it that the regulators haven't been properly funded? And why is it that, despite what we've been told so far, including by those reviews, the government has continued to give billions of dollars to these private operators that are treating our children as an opportunity to make profit, it seems, at all costs. So we do need to understand just how deep these problems go. But those others in the sector are right. We have been told that this is a problem for some time. We are distressingly finding out now just how deep this problem goes. And what we now need is to properly fund those regulators and ensure that now the support is going to those not-for-profits, to the community, the public goods sector that is running childcare centres to look after and educate our children, not as an opportunity to make profit.
Adam, I also wanted to get your reaction to a developing story this afternoon. Israel has begun striking Gaza again on the largest scale since the January ceasefire. How concerned are you over the status of this ceasefire? Is it over?
Look, this is thoroughly unjustified. This is ending the ceasefire by bombing civilians. Now, civilians cannot be asked to pay the price yet again, and there is no justification for doing this. It is in breach of international law to collectively punish civilians. We have Amnesty International saying that what is taking place over the last year is a genocide of the people who are living in Gaza. It is time for the government to now start taking some action and to say to the extremist Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that this is unacceptable and that there will be consequences and there will be attempts made by the international community to ensure that the ceasefire stands, because this shelling and this bombing of civilians is utterly unjustified. Like, yes, of course, the hostages need to be released. We've always called for all of the hostages to be unconditionally released. But bombing of civilians is utterly unjustifiable. And there are things that the Australian government could do to start putting some pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to say that this is unacceptable, it's in breach of international law, and it's time that the government moved from words to action. Otherwise, this could potentially get even worse, tragically.
So are you saying that you think the ceasefire is over?
Well, these steps that are taken, obviously, when the government of Benjamin Netanyahu starts taking steps to bomb civilians, then yes, that does seem to be ending the ceasefire. But however one phrases it, it is unjustifiable. Like, it is an unjustifiable act to say when you have a population of 2.2 million people walled into an area half the size of Canberra with nowhere to go, there's no justification for bombing civilians. And that has now been upheld by international courts, by the United Nations. They have all said there is no justification for bombing civilians, and yet it appears that it is starting again. And it is now time for governments, including the Australian government, to take action, to say that a line has been crossed, this is utterly unacceptable, and we're going to start bringing pressure to bear to stop this bombing.
What does that pressure look like for you? You said the government needs to take action. Specifically, what would you like to see happen?
We could start imposing sanctions on the members of the war cabinet that are now committing war crimes, and not just according to us. The international authorities are now saying very, very clearly that this is in breach of international law. So let's start putting some sanctions on the members of this extremist government. Let's end the two-way military trade that is currently happening with Israel. Like, parts of the F-35 jets that are dropping these bombs have been made here in Australia. Now, other countries like the Netherlands have said that they don't want to be a part of that, and they've stopped doing that. Australia could start to do similar things as well. And then, of course, there are the other steps that could be taken, joining other countries in recognising Palestine, other steps that could be taken, but some immediate things that could be done right now that would just send a signal that this is wrong, that the ceasefire needs to hold, because otherwise I really worry that if this continues and there is no response from the international community, then Benjamin Netanyahu looks around the world and says, well, I get no pushback from this, and so it will escalate, and that would be tragic.
Now, on another topic, last year your housing spokesperson Max Chandler-Mather hopped on stage with CFMEU leadership to protest putting the union into administration. With the additional revelations uncovered this week, do you stand by your comments that his attendance there was legitimate?
Look, we have always said that the concerns that are being revealed, and including today, are incredibly concerning, and there's allegations of crimes that are being committed, and they need to be properly investigated and brought before the courts. And the point that we have been making all along is that the law should apply equally to everyone, and no one gets an exemption from it. And we have a system of the rule of law in this country where if someone has done something wrong and committed a crime, then the authorities should investigate that and bring them before the courts. And again, the distressing revelations that are being revealed today strengthen our view that the governments just need to make sure that our authorities are properly resourced, and that where there is wrongdoing, that action is taken before the courts. Like this now, I think that's where these matters need to go. They're very serious.
Adam Bandt, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing today.
Thanks very much.
And as we mentioned in the interview there, opposition leader Peter Dutton has reignited calls for a referendum, saying it should be considered in response to a 2022 High Court ruling that it's unconstitutional for ministers to strip citizenship from dual nationals who've committed a crime. He says it's different to the Voice referendum and would open up a public conversation about community safety.
You can't out-legislate the Constitution. The Constitution is the rule book, and people don't change it lightly, and they need good reason to. And as you point out with the Voice, it was the wrong issue for the government to put to the people. It could have been dealt with by legislation, and the Prime Minister wouldn't explain the logic, the rationale and the impact of the Voice, and that's why it went down. What we're proposing here is a discussion about whether we've got adequate laws, whether the Constitution is restrictive, and ultimately what I want to do is keep our country safe and keep communities safe.
For some analysis on this, let's bring in senior digital political correspondent Brett Worthington. Brett, thanks for joining us today. Just on this referendum, where has this idea come from?
Yeah, it's definitely one that's kind of been a bit of a captain's call from Peter Dutton. It emerged that he said it in February last year, but we saw the 9 newspapers this morning say that it was actively being considered by senior parts of the coalition. It's one of those interesting ideas that it's not going to happen, in that we're not going to have a referendum on this, and if we were to have a referendum on it, it would fail, as we saw with the Voice. If you don't have bipartisanship and ability to pass a referendum, it's just not going to be something that will happen. So then it becomes a question of, well, what is this idea trying to push, and what's it seeking to solve? Well, there is a problem that the coalition found when it, and Peter Dutton was the minister, it tried to strip citizenship as an act that was carried out by politicians. Now, the court, and the highest court in the land, has said politicians need to stay out of this, that there is a separation, and that it is the courts who issue punishments, not that of government ministers. This would potentially try to work around that, but it is clear that it's an idea that Peter Dutton is wanting to put forward, but it's not necessarily one that we're going to see happen. So
if we're not going to see it happen politically, what does Peter Dutton gain by putting it out there?
Yeah, well, I mean, Peter Dutton's had probably the toughest period of his leadership in recent weeks. We've seen sustained pressure be put on the opposition leader over decisions that he's taken, his own personal life, and then actions such as this one in putting forward this idea. Talking about citizenship stripping leads itself to the coalition arguably having one of its stronger suits of talking about national security, wanting to talk about borders, It's also Peter Dutton and the opposition wanting to reassert its control over both the media narrative and the issues that are discussed here in the Parliament and by our political leaders. That is something that the coalition has not been able to do as successfully in recent weeks like it has previously, so in trying to get back on top of it. It does pose a risk, though. It was Peter Dutton who was warning his front bench not that long ago that he only wants them talking about cost of living, and anyone freelancing into other issues, he would be remembering who it was that was speaking out. Now, all of a sudden, you've got the leader putting out ideas that have got absolutely nothing to do with cost of living, and it's so close to an election. So whether or not it has backlash potentially for Peter Dutton, I think is yet to be seen.
Yeah, do we know how much support he has from within the party?
I think it's definitely caught some by surprise within the party because they're kind of saying, hang on, is this suddenly our policy? The policy essentially saying, let's have a conversation about this thing. Now, that is a conversation that some people might want to have. It is a broad church in the Liberal Party. But you just look at George Brandis, who wrote in the 9 newspapers today. He was a former Attorney General. You can see how those who are constitutional conservatives, this is absolutely something that they would despise and hate. And there are parts of the coalition that will view this as overreach and the political arm trying to tell the courts what they should be doing. So there would be internal unrest, the prospect of wanting to talk about a referendum so close to an election, given the scars that we've seen from the Voice referendum. There are many in the coalition that will not want to be having this conversation. And it's noticeable that we're not seeing many of them out there today seeking to put this policy forward. We've heard from Peter Dutton this morning, but not so much those in his front bench.
And just very quickly, Brett, do we think that this will play into the campaign at all?
I think it's something that Labor will seek to campaign on because they'll put it forward as a thought bubble idea that Peter Dutton is freelancing and not necessarily policy. It comes with risks for Labor. Labor doesn't want to be having an election about national security. It wants to kind of have that debate having played out in the past and not being a feature of the election. So the Prime Minister will likely keep saying it's a thought bubble from Peter Dutton and then pivot into an answer on cost of living because with framing of the budget, the Prime Minister wants to be seen to be talking about issues that are being discussed around kitchen tables rather than national security and the idea of kicking people out of the country.
Brett Worthington, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Steph.
The federal government today has announced $30 million for the restoration of the Adass Israel Synagogue and Community Centre, which was firebombed in an anti-Semitic attack in December last year. Labor MP for Macnamara, Josh Burns, made the announcement at the synagogue today and joins me now.
Good afternoon, Steph.
Hi Josh, thanks for joining us. So you've announced funding for the restoration of the Adass Synagogue. Why do you think it's important the federal government steps in here to help rebuild?
Well, this is a community that came to Australia after World War II. Many of them were Holocaust survivors and they were looking for a safe haven and they were looking for a place to be able to express themselves, to practice their religion, to build a community, and they came with nothing. And the Adass community built up this rich and vibrant community centre in the heart of my electorate in Ripponlea. And anyone who lives around Ripponlea knows it's sort of really an iconic part of Melbourne. And what we saw in December last year was just the most devastating and vile and horrible anti-Semitic attack where 2 people came and burnt down the synagogue. And I was there today and it's still just ruins, and while the clean-up job has begun, it's it's a shell of what that vibrant community centre once was. And I think the most important point, Steph, is that the countries that the community fled allowed anti-Semitism to fester and for people to be persecuted. But here in Australia, it's really important that we send a clear message that racism, that bigotry, that this sort of violence has no place in Australia. And for the federal government to commit $30 million to rebuild the community centre in the synagogue for Adass is a very strong message to say that here in Australia, we want people to be able to practice their faith freely without discrimination, fear or violence, and that here in Australia, people can celebrate who they are and be free in our wonderful multicultural society.
The opposition announced a promise to restore the same synagogue yesterday. Do you wish that you were standing up together in a show of bipartisanship on this issue?
Look, of course I welcome the opposition leader's announcement. We've been working on this for months with the community, and the details have been worked through the budget process. Obviously, we're going back to Parliament next week, so the funding that we announced today is in the budget and it will happen regardless of what happens at the election, which I think is really important, that the community has certainty and doesn't have to worry about who wins the election, but rather can get on with the job of rebuilding their community centre and their synagogue for their members to enjoy.
On bipartisanship, do you think on the issue of anti-Semitism it's frayed in Australia between the major parties?
Look, I've always tried to work with anyone across the parliament to stand up against hate and bigotry, and I've stood with Julian Leeser, I've stood with Dave Sharma, I've stood with James Patterson, I've stood with Allegra Spender, I've stood with people from right across the parliament because for me it's been personal. It's been something that I've lived through for the last 15 months in a way that I couldn't have never imagined here in Australia, and I know what it feels like, and I know how important it is to actually just confront it in a united way. So I've never tried to play politics with this, and I'll continue to work with people right across the parliament in order to get the best outcomes and to make sure that I think that's actually what people are looking for, is people are looking for leaders of this country to work together, to stand shoulder to shoulder and to stamp out any form of bigotry or discrimination, because Australia is not served by us bickering with each other. We're served much better by tackling this head on and stamping it out where we see it.
Israel has begun a new wave of airstrikes in Gaza today, despite the ceasefire, reportedly killing more than 200 people. How concerned are you about the status of this ceasefire now?
I mean, it's devastating, Steph, and obviously we welcomed the ceasefire when it occurred, and the images of hostages being released and of families being reunited with people after 500 days, has been so heartwarming. And of course, we want to see Palestinian people just being able to start this long process of rebuilding their lives and the infrastructure in Gaza. And what we've seen of the moves by refusing to delay or delaying the release of hostages, and these sort of really ugly public displays of humiliation by Hamas has obviously been really provoking, and of course we don't want an eruption of violence to return. I don't want to see Palestinian lives lost. I don't want to see Israelis continuously being caught as hostage. I want to see peace, and that's what we certainly hope for.
Are you concerned that this will further inflame domestic tensions here over this conflict?
Well, it can't, and we've seen over the last 15 months people in our politics try and use this conflict for their own political advantage, and there is frankly no excuse for targeting Jewish institutions like Adass for however people might feel about what's going on the other side of the world. I mean, we are literally on the other side of the world, and we have Jewish communities here in Australia that should be safe and shouldn't be the target of any angry attack. There is no justification for that. And of course, I want all communities. I want the Islamic community, the Palestinian community in Australia to be safe as well. I don't want anyone to feel the sort of wrath or blowback of what people might be feeling about how devastating the Middle East conflict is. There is no excuse for that, and I want people to be safe here in Australia, and that's our primary focus, and that's what we have to remain committed to and focused on as leaders of this country.
And just finally, Josh, your seat of Macnamara is being targeted heavily by all parties this election. A new poll has shown you in third place behind the Liberals and the Greens. Will you put the Greens last on your how to vote cards, and how concerned are you about retaining your seat?
Oh, look, I think Macnamara is obviously a fascinating seat, and a lot of people pay a lot of attention to it. I mean, it's by far the best seat in the country. I'm in it right now here in the ABC studios, but we have so many amazing institutions, creative institutions, beautiful restaurants. We had Macnamara on display to the world with the Grand Prix on the weekend. We obviously have a vibrant Jewish community, a proud LGBTIQ community. I mean, it's just such a wonderful part of Melbourne, and I'm very lucky to be the representative. And I've worked extremely hard, and I'll continue to do so. I don't take anything for granted. There'll be lots of polls between now and the election day, but I'm just focused on doing my best for the people I'm privileged to represent, and I'll continue to do so for as long as I'm in this really privileged position of being the member for Macnamara.
Josh Burns, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Steph.
Turning now to the US, Trade Minister Don Farrell has held more talks with American officials in the hope Australia will be able to avoid further US tariffs. Last week, the US put a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium imports. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump is expected to hold a phone call with Vladimir Putin later today, discussing the conflict in Ukraine. To sum up all things America, earlier we spoke with Senior Fellow at the United States Study Centre, Bruce Wolpe. Bruce Wolpe, welcome to the program. Donald Trump's trying to win Putin's support for a ceasefire. US officials are trying to sound positive, but it is a different tone from Moscow. Who do you think will be calling the shots on this call?
Well, it's President Trump's initiative. Putin has accepted. There was the meeting last week between Stephen Witkoff, the special negotiator, and Putin directly, and he said it went on for 3 or 4 hours, and that it was productive. And then at the press briefing earlier today in Washington, the press secretary said we're on the 10-yard line, in football parlance, within range to score. But it is very complicated. Witkoff said that. It's a 2,000-kilometer border. There are many issues in the nuclear power plant, the ports. There's the status of Crimea and what happens to that. And then when there's this peculiar quote that Trump said on the plane coming back to Washington, dividing up certain assets, well, what does that mean? We know about strategic minerals, and Trump wants to get America's hands on that. But so a lot up in the air, but that they're meeting. This is the first really hard meeting. And the important thing is, what does it lead to next?
I wanted to ask you, Bruce, about the dividing assets quote. What message would it send to China if the US lets Russia annex land after this invasion?
People have been very quick to seize on a parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine and big powers and what happens to those territories. So they're going to follow it very closely. And what's really interesting, I was thinking about it earlier today, China's next. We focused on tariffs, we focused on Europe, we focused on NATO, we focused on Russia and on Gaza. But there's been no direct engagement, strategic engagement with China. So what happens on the European front will come to fruition as far as China is concerned. I've heard talk of a June summit between Trump and Xi. So we'll see. But yes, they're all over it.
And what do you imagine the dividing assets could mean here? Can you break it down for us?
Well, I think Trump has already said to Zelensky, you want peace, you want to keep your country and so forth. Well, you're going to have to give some things up. Land, you won't get all the land that Russia has seized. And there's also Kursk that's been going on from Ukraine. So you want your freedom, you're going to have to settle for stuff. And this is where the Europeans come in, who also see precedents set by these negotiations. And the question of security guarantees. Is there going to be a peacekeeping force? And the Prime Minister, of course, has been actively engaged in that discussion. So it's not just Russia, US, Ukraine. It is a larger table. And again, we really have to see how big those other figures are at the table when they sit down to finally get a deal out. The strongest thing to look for, will there be a 30-day ceasefire in the very near future?
If we move on to tariffs, Australia is trying to account for the indirect impacts of a trade war. How do governments prepare for this when the future is so uncertain?
That is really rough. I mean, Australia was treated really roughly when the tariffs on aluminium and steel were imposed. And Trump, two things out of that. First, the hardliners in the Trump White House are stronger than ever and believe they were right. No exemption for Australia, no exemption for anybody else. Trump is correct. He wants to prosecute the case. We're here to serve the president, and that's exactly what we will do. So something that could be seen in Australian eyes as smaller, non-tariff barriers suddenly loom very large. And this is America first. And I think Trump wants the maximum out of every point of leverage that he can get. So there have been calculations run. I know the AFR had a very important piece on what could be the non-tariff barrier cost be in trade, and does it affect beef, lamb, does it affect pharmaceuticals, extremely important. And that's what's on the table, but I am not optimistic that Australia can curb the blow that's going to come. Trump is looking forward to April 2nd as a really big day, and he's not going to desist from his objectives.
The Trade Minister, Don Farrell, has said Australia won't back down from seeking an exemption after conversations with US trade representatives. It sounds like you're pessimistic about an exemption. Is it a possibility at all, or has that ship sailed?
I think it's a possibility, but I would just keep expectations low and then figure out if it can be minimized to a degree in the discussions. And wish Don Farrell the best in his discussions with the United States Trade Representative. But Trump wants to make sure he's winning on all these issues with all these countries. And it doesn't matter that Australia's played by the best rules, has been the highest example of what America would want in a trade partner. Australia has a trade deficit with the United States, has a free trade agreement. It really is amounting to serve for very little, reward very little for Australia at this time. And that's a real shame.
The latest OECD estimates show that the Trump trade wars are splintering the global economy. Under its projections, Mexico would be pushed into a recession. Canada's growth is impacted severely. US growth does slow, but not as much. Can you explain why that is?
Well, ultimately, there's a lot of upheaval going on in the United States with the federal government, the size of the public service, these tariffs coming into effect, supply chain issues, pricing issues. So people are anxious about the economy, and the polls are showing that most Americans disapprove of Trump's economic performance so far, even though more people think the country's moving in the right direction. Those are Trump supporters saying we're very glad that he's there. His favorability rating is still underwater by 4 or 5 points. So he is not registering in political terms where he would like to be, but he has all the power to exercise what he wants to do. So I think people feel the times are uncertain. What's going to happen with inflation because of tariffs? And then what happens with interest rates? And what happens with the economic future? The big political question is not now. The question is 12 months from now. What does the economy look like? And does it mean that Trump has been correct? And will he reap political rewards next year, an election year, by virtue of his policies? Up in the air right now.
I also wanted to ask you about the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. There's a lot of concern pharmaceuticals could be subject to the next round of tariffs. Can you explain why the PBS is such an ideological threat to Trump? You mentioned the non-tariff barrier. The PBS is one of them. Can you just break that down a bit for us?
It's price controls, just really strong price regulation of pharmaceuticals in Australia. Australia's market is significant to the industry, but it's a big global industry. But in just raw political terms in Washington, the pharmaceutical industry has more political clout in the United States than it does in Australia. This is an easy one for the president to give to Big Pharma and their agenda, which they will deeply appreciate, which goes into other calculations on other health policy decisions in the United States and in Congress. So this is almost a no-brainer for Trump to prosecute and see what he can get. But it is. I mean, it means there's a potential real threat to the Australia PBS system and pricing and what it means for every Australian household in the country. So this has to be watched very closely.
And so the Trump administration sees the subsidising of medicines as affecting free trade. Is that the crux of the concern?
Yes, affecting free trade. And the same thing on energy and environment. Any rules that impede the development of energy resources, particularly fossil fuels, petroleum and so forth, natural gas. The default position of President Trump and the administration is we're against all that. We want freer markets with these companies being empowered to go forward as fast as they can.
Bruce Walpy, thank you so much for joining us on Afternoon Briefing. We always appreciate your insight and expertise.
Thank you, Stephanie.
As we've been reporting, almost 2 months into the ceasefire in Gaza, the truce has been shattered, with Israel launching a series of airstrikes. Loud explosions have been heard, with Palestinian officials reporting the death toll is continuing to grow. Let's bring in our Middle East correspondent, Matthew Doran, for the latest. Matt, thanks for joining us. What do we know about the strikes at the moment? How many people have been killed?
Steph, good afternoon. That death toll is continuing to rise as we are seeing further details of the scale of destruction emerge from across Gaza. The latest counts putting the death toll at more than 200, with many more people reported as being casualties, being injured in these strikes. It is very early still here in the Middle East, and the strikes happened in the middle of the night, the very early hours of this morning, taking many people by surprise. rise right across Gaza. These strikes have been extensive as well, stretching from the north of the Strip right through central parts of Gaza. Deir al-Balah is one of the areas that's been hit, and then further south towards the Egyptian border, areas such as Khan Yunis and Rafah also bearing the brunt of these Israeli strikes. The Israeli Prime Minister's office has said that this is in response to what it says is Hamas's refusal to release Israeli hostages still held in captivity in Gaza, and it is also in response to Hamas's rejection of proposals to extend the ceasefire beyond its current term. That ceasefire did lapse a fortnight ago. There have been negotiations underway to see how it would be going forward. Hamas, for its part, has put forward some proposals. Israel has put forward some proposals, but there has not been an agreement reached there. So we're continuing to monitor this situation. It is still developing, Steph, with more of those details coming through. We are seeing some unconfirmed reports that senior members of Hamas have been killed in these strikes, but we are also seeing reports from Palestinian health authorities in Gaza that many of those who have been killed and injured in these strikes have been children, and some really horrific scenes coming out of Gaza with parents rushing through the streets, clutching the bodies of their tiny children who've borne the brunt of these strikes.
Matt, I know this story is still developing. Is it too early to ask whether this is the end of the ceasefire?
It does seem weird, Steph, for us to be discussing whether or not a ceasefire still exists when Israel has launched these extensive strikes, but the ceasefire is still technically in force. A lot of what will impact that will be coming out over the next couple of hours or so when we see how Hamas responds, when we see whether Israel continues to launch even more strikes into Gaza. We know that the Israeli authorities have put communities along the Gaza border on notice. They've called off school for today for children there, saying that there could be a threat of some sort of retaliation coming from Hamas in Gaza. So we're really going to have to wait to see how that is playing out. The initial phase of the ceasefire, that initial 6-week period, which started on the 19th of January, that lapsed a fortnight ago. And we've been in this limbo period, for want of a better phrase, ever since then, with the ceasefire still technically holding, but no agreement as to how the situation will move forward. Certainly this does put a different spin and a different focus on those ongoing ceasefire negotiations that are being mediated by Qatar and by Egypt. Those talks have been underway for many weeks now. They have not borne any fruit whatsoever, but this does give a different dimension to those negotiations going forward, if indeed they do continue.
And Matt, has there been any reaction from the United States yet in relation to these strikes?
We have heard from the White House press secretary saying that Israel gave the Trump administration advance warning of these strikes. This is something that is going to be something of great debate here for much of the day. What sort of green light, for want of a better phrase, did the White House provide Israel in going ahead with these strikes? We know that the IDF presented its proposal to the government to carry out these strikes last week, so this has been bubbling away rather for some time, but the White House was given advance notice and says that this is a further indication of its unwillingness to continue on with these stalled ceasefire negotiations, insisting that Hamas needs to give some ground here. So that's what we've heard from the United States. Something which will be really interesting to watch here in Israel over the course of the next few hours, Steph, is that there were large-scale protests being planned against the Netanyahu government, which were meant to start today and roll into tomorrow. There are many allegations levelled at the Prime Minister that he is continuing this war simply for his own political gain, that he is putting the interests of staying in office ahead of bringing hostages home. 59 Israeli hostages still in Gaza, more than 30 of them believed to be dead. Those protests were due to kick off this morning, and no doubt they will also take on a different turn now, considering what we have seen overnight in Gaza. Steph?
Matt Doran in Jerusalem, thanks so much for joining us today. And here are our top stories this half hour. As we were just discussing, Israel has broken the ceasefire agreement with Hamas, launching dozens of airstrikes into Gaza. Palestinian officials are reporting the death toll is continuing to grow. Currently, it stands at about 200 people, including children. The Prime Minister has instructed the IDF to take strong action against Hamas, accusing the group of repeatedly refusing to release Israeli hostages. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has reignited calls for a referendum, saying he wants a public debate about changing the constitution to give politicians the ability to deport dual citizens. A 2022 High Court ruling found it unconstitutional for ministers to strip citizenship from dual nationals. The Prime Minister has rubbished the idea, calling the proposal a thought bubble. There are calls for an inquiry and overhaul of the childcare sector in the wake of the Four Corners expose into abuse and neglect within the industry. 1 in 10 childcare centres has never been rated by regulators and others don't meet the standards. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese ruled out holding a royal commission into the industry. Treasurer Jim Chalmers delivered an address at the Queensland Media Club today, previewing next week's federal budget. He expressed concern that the impact of a global trade war on the Australian economy could be up to 4 times larger than the steel and aluminium tariffs levied by the United States. His message was interrupted, however, when 2 climate protesters took to the stage carrying signs reading "No new coal or gas."
Days of heavy winds and soaking rain saw major flooding and substantial damage.
Australia cannot afford any more climate disasters, the intensity of those. When will the Labor Party stop funding more coal and gas projects? When will the Labor Party stop funding coal and gas projects? When will the Labor Party stop funding coal and gas projects?
Meant that more than 450,000 Australians were cut off from power.
Young people of this nation are going to suffer for the rest of their lives. When is Labor going to stop funding and approving coal and gas? You cannot say you're dealing with a disaster while you are funding the disaster.
Returning to the tariffs, let's bring in Shadow Trade Minister Kevin Hogan now from Coffs Harbour. Kevin, thanks for joining us. On tariffs, Don Farrell has said Australia won't back down from seeking a tariff exemption after conversations with US trade representatives. You've been critical of the government for not getting an exemption thus far. If you win the election as Trade Minister, are you confident you'll be able to negotiate one?
Well, what I would say, Stephanie, is what we certainly will do is be going over to see Trump personally. I think what we know is Trump is a leader-to-leader type operator. So I think the disappointing thing so far is that our Prime Minister Albanese hasn't gone to the United States. It's up to nearly 5 months since he's been elected. We want to do a deal with Trump to not have these tariffs put onto our products, especially come April 2nd, where there are others to be, are touted that they might get a tariff. So what I want to see is the Prime Minister go leader to leader and go over and do a deal with Trump. These tariffs is bad policy. I think what Trump is doing is bad policy for America. What I think he's doing is obviously bad policy for global growth in Australia as well. But I want to see the Prime Minister of Australia go over there and have a leader-to-leader dialogue and do a deal.
So if you win the election, Peter Dutton will go over leader to leader and secure a deal?
Well, I think we've got a better chance of Peter Dutton going over and doing a deal with Trump than Albanese, because as we know in the past, as you know, Stephanie, Albanese has said that he's scared of Donald Trump. That's not the attitude we want. We want him to be in the game, we want him to be over there, and we want him to be negotiating hard with the President to make sure we get a good deal.
Beyond Australia getting a carve-out, the global consequences of this trade war could be huge. How would you navigate that as Trade Minister if the coalition wins the election?
Yeah, look, a really good question. So I start by saying again that I think increasing tariffs by any country is a bad idea. Australia exported $650 billion worth of goods and services last year. It's funding our country. 1 in 4 jobs in Australia is a direct export job, and when you add indirect businesses or direct businesses to support those industries, it's even more than 1 in 4 jobs in Australia, and they pay well. All in regional Australia, our big exports, iron ore, coal, gas, food and ag, are the big drivers of our economic growth. So I'm very pro-trade because Australia's done very well out of it. What I'd be looking to do was talk and work with similar countries like us, Japan, South Korea, some of the European countries, some of the South American countries, who the rules-based order within the WTO trading system, we would support that. We need to buttress it and protect it from attacks like countries that want to put up tariffs.
The Australian Financial Review's reporting Australia faces a potential tariff on between 2 and 8% on exports to the US like beef and pharmaceuticals. If that turns out to be the case, that's relatively low compared to the 25% tariffs on metals. Would that be a win for the government?
Well, look, I don't believe any tariff is a win, and again, I say for America either. I mean, when a country puts on a tariff, all that it really does, I believe, is make the cost of that good more expensive for the consumer, in this case, the American consumer. So I think it's bad policy from Trump. But what I say is, you know, we know he's transactional, we know he's leader to leader. When we got the exemption last time, it was leader to leader. So I want to see Albanese have a go. I want to see him go to the US. I want him to have a direct conversation with Trump, sell our cause and convince him that this is a bad policy, not only for us, but for him.
Moving to another topic, Peter Dutton has suggested holding a referendum on the ability to deport dual citizens. The Coalition consistently said the Voice referendum was a distraction from cost of living issues. How would this referendum be any different?
Well, this referendum. I don't think necessarily we will have to have a referendum, and hopefully we won't have to. Obviously, it's a tool in our arsenal if we need to. But what this is about dual citizens who are terrorists. So this is about people who have Australian citizenship and a citizenship of another country who are terrorists and have committed an act to either harm us or harm other people. We obviously do not want those people in Australia. If those people are trying to bomb something in Australia or try to do some terrorist act in Australia, we do not want them to stay here, and we want them to go back to the country of which they are a citizen of as well. Now, we've tried regulation, we've tried legislation to have governments be given the power to remove those dual citizens. The High Court has found against that, and the High Court has said the way our Constitution is drawn up makes that difficult. So this is not our first option. We do not want to have a referendum as a first option. We want to look at other solutions so that we can make these terrorists leave our country and go back to the other country of which they're a citizen of. So I think what Peter's saying quite reasonably is we will have other things that we'll try and do first. If they're not, it may be something we need to look at.
Was this proposal discussed by the party room or the leadership team? Were you consulted as a shadow minister?
There is strong support, and we've spoken about this issue in the past because obviously of the High Court challenge that was made in this discussion, that there's strong support within the Coalition leadership and the Coalition MPs that these dual citizens who are terrorists, who are looking to harm people in Australia, who have no allegiance to our country and who are trying to harm us, we want to send them back to another country or the other country that they're a citizen of, and there is very strong support for that.
How many people would this impact? How many dual citizens are there who've committed crimes like terrorism?
Well, look, we know there's been some already because we've already tried to deport them. The exact number I don't have off the top of my head, but there are a number of people in Australia, and look, one's too many, right? But there are certainly more than one people in Australia right now who are dual citizens who have been charged with terrorism acts, and we don't want them to stay, and I don't think that's unreasonable.
Shouldn't you have an idea of how many people there are before floating the idea of a referendum?
Well, I'd say one's too many. And it's more than one. And we know that there may be more ongoing, so the risk is there. So if there is one person in this country that is happy to blow something up and kill Australian citizens, it's one too many. But there's more than that. So to have the power that we can send them back to the other country that they are a citizen of, I think is important.
Are we only talking about terror crimes here, just to clarify?
Well, predominantly, yes. I mean, at the moment, that's what we're looking at. That's the High Court challenge or the High Court case was an act of terrorism. So that's primarily what we're talking about. People who have looked to blow things up, to do a terrorism attack in Australia. We've tried to send them back. That hasn't worked to date. We're going to look at other measures to try and let the government have the power to do that.
Former Liberal Attorney General George Brander says it's a bad idea and it should be ruled out. Is he wrong?
Well, I think, I respect difference of opinion in this country, and we live in a democracy, and good on George. I don't have a problem with George having that opinion. I disagree with him. I think that, this isn't our first scenario. This is not the first thing we want to do, is have a referendum. We have other things that we're going to try and do and legislate and do things to make this work. But it's just something that we may have to look at later if this doesn't succeed. But I don't think there are many Australians that would have a problem with the fact that we're saying if someone has committed a terrorist act in this country and tried to kill us or tried to kill Australians and commit an act like that, that we want them to go back to the other country of which they're a citizen of. I think the vast majorities would be in favour of that.
Just on another topic, Israel's begun a new wave of airstrikes in Gaza today, despite the ceasefire, reportedly killing more than 200 people. How concerned are you about the status of that ceasefire?
Yeah, well, look, Israel in a very difficult situation. Hamas, a terrorist organisation, have committed many very abhorrent acts. And Israel, I quite well understand, are not going to stop until they get every one of those hostages back. I understand that's stalled, and that's why we're in the situation we are.
A Four Corners investigation has exposed systemic failures in the childcare sector. The Prime Minister's called for investigation. The Greens want a royal commission. Would the coalition support either of those?
Well, look, certainly we're concerned about the reports. I mean, we want all childcare centres to be operating at the best standard they could, and for parents to have great, no concerns about that, and know that the children are safe and in good institutions. So I think to have a look at that, I think it was a good report that we need to investigate. Absolutely.
And just finally, Kevin Hogan, the budget will be handed down next week. Treasurer Jim Chalmers says ex-tropical cyclone Alfred will cost the budget $1.2 billion. It will hit growth and put pressure on inflation. Will the opposition be pledging more money to help boost community resilience to natural disasters in your reply?
Yeah, well, look, I think, this budget's going to have more problems than the $1 billion that we have to spend for tropical cyclone Alfred. I mean, that was money, I think, well spent. We have to keep our community safe, and there's disaster recovery measures as part of that. But there'll be much bigger, I think, things going on in the budget next week than that. But that being said, I think what we do need to do, which is very important, in this country, we spend far too much on disaster recovery, and we need to spend more money on mitigation, as in prevention of disasters. In my area alone, for example, we have a flooding risk, and there's flood mitigation measures that you can do that mitigate floods. It means floods wouldn't be as damaging or high as in flood levels than they otherwise would be, and I think there needs to be an increased focus on that for sure.
Kevin Hogan, that's where we'll leave it today. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Returning to our top story today, the government says it will investigate the childcare sector after Four Corners exposed systemic issues and cases of abuse and neglect. Let's bring in the Early Childhood Education Minister, Anne Aly, to discuss this further. And thanks for joining us. This Four Corners investigation exposed a flawed and inconsistent regulatory system for childcare centres with allegations of abuse. Can I just ask you firstly, what was your initial reaction when you saw the story?
Yeah, look, I think the behaviours that were reported in last night's story are deeply, deeply concerning. And I want to make it very clear that there is no tolerance for those kinds of behaviours in early childhood education and care sector. We care deeply and are committed to child wellbeing and safety, and understand that parents rightly expect that when they drop off their children in early childhood education and care, that their children are well looked after, that they're safe and that they're secure. I might point out that the vast majority of providers and the vast majority of early childhood educators are dedicated professionals who care deeply about safety and child development and child education. I might also point out that I expect that state and territory governments fulfil their regulatory obligations and ensure that services operating within their jurisdictions comply with the National Quality Framework. Now, this afternoon, I have asked the CEO of the National Quality Authority to give some immediate advice on what more can be done around child safety and security, building on the 2023 recommendations of the report that myself and the Minister for Education, Jason Clare, commissioned, that gives us a range of recommendations for improving child safety in early childhood education and care. All state and territory ministers and the Commonwealth Government have agreed on those recommendations, and we're making good progress in implementing those recommendations, and we'll continue working with state and territory governments to ensure that child safety and wellbeing are front and centre of our early childhood education and care system.
You mentioned the state and territory regulators. Given how systemic these failures and breaches have been here, does the federal government need to take over regulation to ensure children's safety?
Well, yeah, early childhood education and care and the regulation of early childhood education and care services is a shared responsibility. The states have a responsibility and the federal government has a responsibility. And so I would reiterate that I expect state and territory governments to fulfil their regulatory obligations and ensure that services within their jurisdictions comply with the National Quality Framework.
The Commonwealth pays childcare subsidies. You're writing the cheques. Wouldn't it make sense for you to also fund the regulators upholding these national standards?
As I said, it's a shared responsibility between state and federal governments. The federal government has a responsibility for the National Quality Framework. The state governments have a responsibility for the regulation. Embedded within the National Quality Framework are safety, security and child health and wellbeing measures. And I expect that state and territory governments fulfil that regulatory responsibility.
The Prime Minister says he supports an investigation into the sector. I know it's early days, but what are you anticipating that might look like? The Greens are calling for a royal commission. Why won't you consider that, and what will this investigation look like?
Well, the Prime Minister, as the Prime Minister said, royal commissions take years. Now, these are not issues that have just cropped up in early childhood education and care. They are long-standing issues. But this is the first time we have a federal government and the federal Labor government that is taking reform seriously and that has a program of reform. We have already commissioned a review by the ACCC, a review by the Productivity Commission. We have in 2023, as I mentioned, the review into child safety and wellbeing in early childhood education and care. Those reviews are informing our pathway to a system, a universal early childhood education and care system that is based on quality, affordability and accessibility for every child in Australia. We'll continue to refer to the reviews that we have done and the consultations that we have with the sector, with families, with educators to chart that pathway to universal early childhood education and care, which is quality, which is affordable and which is accessible.
And on another topic, Israel has begun striking Gaza again today, the biggest attack since the start of this ceasefire. How concerned are you about this and the status of the ceasefire?
I'm deeply concerned. I think the ceasefire gave hope of the stages towards a more lasting peace between Palestine and Israel. I have said before, and I will say it again, there is absolutely no justification for the collective punishment of Palestinian civilians by the Israeli Defence Forces. And this is deeply, deeply concerning. I continue to push for, and I know Australia will continue to push for, an end to the hostilities, a lasting ceasefire and a lasting peace.
Can I also ask you about Peter Dutton's idea for a referendum to deport dual citizens that have committed serious crimes? We just heard Shadow Trade Minister Kevin Hogan say that one person is too many to be a dual citizen that's committed a serious crime like terrorism. What's your response to that?
Well, our constitution is very clear. A citizen is a citizen and all citizens should be treated equally. I think the Prime Minister described this as a thought bubble. I would add to that Peter Dutton likes to punch down and he likes to utilise the politics of division and politics of fear for what he sees to be as political gain. I agree with the Prime Minister that this is a thought bubble.
What would the government do, or what is the government doing to deal with dual citizens who have committed crimes like terrorism?
We have laws in place. And we continue to follow the letter of the law. What we're talking about here is Peter Dutton wanting to spend millions of taxpayer dollars on a referendum to change our constitution, to give himself the power to strip away citizenship as he sees fit. I think that many Australians would find that idea of a single politician having the power to strip them of their citizenship to be quite untasteful.
when pressing Kevin Hogan about this idea earlier, he didn't have any specific figures on exactly how many dual citizens might have committed crimes like terrorism. Are you concerned about the coalition putting this on the table without those details in place?
I'm concerned that it will be a free-for-all. You know, where does it stop? Who decides? If Peter Dutton wants the power to decide who gets citizenship and who doesn't, or who gets their citizenship stripped and who doesn't get their citizens stripped, I think all Australians should be concerned about that.
Anne Aly, thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's afternoon briefing for today. Stay with us here on ABC News. Joe O'Brien is up next with today's top stories. See you soon.